So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Giacomo Solano, and I'm the head of research at the Migration Policy Group. Welcome to this webinar, which will explore the link between integration policies and integration outcomes, migrant integration outcomes, through the lens of MIPEX. So during this webinar, with also the other speakers, we will try to address and to answer to the question whether policies matter, and also what kind of policies matter and in which policy area related to integration. So to all the participants, and I would kindly ask you to mute yourself, switch off your camera, so that we can run the presentation as smoothly as possible. So just to start, as you probably know, there is a huge field of research comparing migration and integration policies across country and across time by using a different set of indicators that are then combined into indexes. And these indexes produce what is called a summary score, which represent the level of policy, integration policy, for example, in the case of MIPEX, in a given country in a given year. Researchers in the field have also linked integration policy or migration policies to integration outcomes and migration trends. When I talk about integration outcomes, I refer, for example, about the unemployment rate of the country, or for an individual, for a migrant, whether or not the migrant is in employment, for example. This has been done to understand the effect of policies, and in a policy-making perspective, to understand what works, what doesn't, and also the condition under which this policy can have a positive impact and can be effective. So today we will address this topic, and we will start with a presentation by myself and my colleague Thomas Adelson, who is currently a research and strategic advisor at MPG. And we will present the results of a meta-analysis we conducted last year on previous literature and previous studies using MIPEX and linking MIPEX to migrant integration outcomes. So we will summarize our findings, the lesson learned, and the possible new avenues for research. We will then move to the second part of the webinar, in which we have three speakers: Sol Juarez, who is an associate professor in public health sciences at the Stockholm University, then Martin Vink, professor of citizenship studies at the European University Institute, and then Konrad Ziller, a professor in political sciences at the University of Duisburg-Essen. These three speakers will display cases and concrete studies that have linked MIPEX to migrant integration outcomes, and they will answer to the question what policies matter, and also regarding for whom these policies matter. We will then finish with the Q&A session. You can start as soon as you want to pose question in the chat, and then during the Q&A session we will answer to your question. But you can start since the beginning to write down your questions. Before moving to the first presentation, I want just to illustrate very briefly for the few that doesn't know MIPEX, what MIPEX is. MIPEX is considered one of the most comprehensive tools to compare migration policies, and it focuses on integration policies. We rely, why it's being considered as a comprehensive and also reliable tool. First, because we combine a methodology that relies on national experts. So we have one or two or even three national experts for each country. And I saw also the names of some of them in this webinar. And then we will check, we combine this with the centralized analysis and check of the standardized questionnaire filled by the expert in order to ensure comparability of the results and of the analysis across time and countries, of course. Since MIPEX was run in 5 different editions, we have now a longitudinal scope, and MIPEX spans across from 2007 across a period of time from 2007 to 2019. We have a wide thematic scope as we cover 8 different policy areas like from labor market to education, from access to citizenship to anti-discrimination. And we also include health, which is, of course, particularly important amid the COVID crisis. In the last edition, we covered 52 countries, so we improved or increased, let's say, the MIPEX geographical scope. And in the following month, we will add also additional countries, like, for example, the Emirates and Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and South Africa. MIPEX has been also used over the time by a wide range of actors and users, indeed, like policymakers, NGOs, the media, but also researchers, as we are seeing today. It has also been mentioned by the first draft of the Global Compact of Migration as a powerful tool to monitor integration policies of the countries. So I'm now moving to the first part of the webinar, and I will introduce then the results of our meta-analysis on previous literature and studies linking MIPEX to migrant integration outcomes. I will start, and then my colleague Thomas will continue. So as I already said, we conducted meta-analysis, and this was done, of course, under the umbrella of MIPEX, but thanks to two different projects. The first one is the ongoing Horizon 2020 project, Hummingbird, which focuses on migration trends, and MPG as a part in this, or MPG's part in this project is really to link migration trends to migration and integration policies, and to see the link between these two. We also, this analysis, thanks to a consultancy work together with IUM and the Clinton Institute of the University College of Dublin. So we are really grateful to both of this project, and thanks to that, we were able to conduct this analysis. So we decided to focus on integration policies, as I already said, and to focus only on the literature using MIPEX to measure integration policy. This has been done for a matter of consistency and to be sure that integration policy has been measured in the same consistent way across all the studies analyzed and papers analyzed. We decided to focus on the last 10 years, so from 2010 to mid-2020, when we finished the review, the meta-analysis. And we conducted, as I said, the literature review. We use Google Scholar and not, for example, Scopus or Web of Science, because we know that there are also papers that focus on this link that were published in journals or as a working paper, so not indexed in Web of Science or Scopus. So we decided to go for Google Scholars to be more inclusive, let's say. And we use keywords such as MIPEX, for example, and then we select only the articles linking MIPEX to integration outcomes. By this methodology and this strategy, we selected 128 articles, which resulted in more than 400 entries. An entry is a link, let's say, between an independent variable and a dependent variable. So it happened that in one article, we had like 3 or 4 entries. For example, if there were different models, or if there were the MIPEX overall score and the score of a MIPEX sub-area, like labor market, for example, which were sometimes included in the same model or in 2 different models with the same dependent variable. So among these 413 entries, we found that in the 60% of the time, there was a significant effect. Most of the time, this effect was positive, but there were also cases in which the relationship and the effect was negative. We also focused on only the situation in which let's say the independent variable and the dependent variable were matched. That means they belong to the same policy area. Like, for example, if labor market outcome of migrants was the dependent variable, the independent variable was the MIPEX score on the labor market area, and not the overall MIPEX score, for example. But here we see that there was not much difference and variation between the results in general and the result when it comes to these matched entries, as again only the majority, let's say, of of the entries were, or the effect were significant, 63% in this case. To try, let's say, to start answering to the key question of this webinar, we can see from the previous results and also from this table that indeed integration policies do matter somehow, and inclusive integration policies are linked or associated with positive migrants integration outcomes. We can see also from this table that, first of all, the analysis or the amount of articles focusing on the topics, on the different topics varies. Like you see that, for example, public attitude toward migrants have been analyzed quite frequently, while, for example, only one article looked at family reunification. So you can see that there is a variation, and we can, of course, be, let's say, sure on some topics, and while other topics should be explored more into detail. You can see also that the positive effect or the fact that integration policy matter is particularly true in some areas, like, for example, when it comes to public attitudes toward migrants, but also when it comes to the identity, so the identity of migrants, the health situation of the migrants, their political participation, and access to nationality, for example. While in other socioeconomic outcomes, the relation is less clear. Then we also asked ourselves, or we decided to investigate when, so under what condition, let's say, there was, or the positive effect was more likely to be there. So I ran a logistic regression, and the dependent variable was whether or not there was a positive significant effect. We put some variables linked to methodology, some others linked to the sample size, and also one which we consider very important, the MIPEX overall, so on the content. So we contrast the situation in which the dependent variable was the MIPEX overall score with the situation in which the independent variable, was a score from another substrand of MIPEX. So overall score against a substrand score. And we saw that the MIPEX overall effect was significant and positive. In our analysis, this might mean two things. The first one, from a methodological standpoint, it might be, or it might suggest that the MIPEX overall score is a more accurate measure of the overall integration approach, or the integration approach of a country. So this is why it's more likely to be significant. On a more content, let's say, related standpoint, this might also suggest that the comprehensive approach to integration is more effective than a sectorial support or focus, let's say. And you also see that bigger samples, so the sample size, and also, like, for example, the number of individuals included in the analysis, and the number of countries matters. And of course, it's an explanation of why it's significant, the effect. So I now leave the floor to my colleague, Thomas.
Thank you. Thank you, Giacomo. So we will continue to grow this database and continue the analysis. But we were also trying to understand, how and why do integration policies matter? And for that, we come back to the general literature about effects of integration policies. And I turn to the framework developed by Chaika and de Haas, looking at the effectiveness of immigration policies that hypothesize that there might be potential gaps between a government's intentions and the policies in paper and in practice. The first assumption is that there might be some kind of discursive gap in our field, meaning that the public discourse might not at all match with integration policies, which you could imagine makes then policy implementation or effectiveness extremely difficult if actually government and the public don't support the policies in place. This was assumed a lot in the 1990s and 2000s, that there was some kind of divergence between policies and public opinion. Perhaps this could lead to ineffective integration policies. A second gap is more in the implementation of the policies, laws, regulations, measures that exist, and then in contrast to the discretion that authorities have, the resources they have, the interests, the constraints that they have, could lead to an implementation gap that policies on paper are not actually implemented on the ground. And the third potential gap is an efficacy gap. Policies might be fully implemented, but policies actually might not be very important factors driving outcomes in the integration process, which might actually be more determined by the kind of major determining factors that we know run behind integration, such as language levels, employment outcomes, the labor market at the time, and so on. Those factors might actually be much more determinant of integration than actually whatever policies exist, even if they're very well implemented. So our field has been proceeding ahead as if these three gaps all exist at the same time and to a significant extent. What's, I think, really interesting as we grow this integration policy meta-analysis is we're actually able to respond to see where these gaps exist or might not exist, and hopefully give some more reasonable expectations for the literature and for policymakers for what their integration policies can achieve. Because when this type of research was started in the early 2000s, people assumed that integration policies would determine whether or not immigrants had jobs, and not just the first generation, but the first and the second generation, right? So there were a lot of initial research assumed that integration policies could change everything. Hopefully, with more analysis in this area, we can have more reasonable expectations for what happens in our field. So moving on, I just took the analyses and I looked then at the conceptual framework here and the database that we have of results. So first question I have is, well, is there a discursive gap? Does it seem that actually integration policies are not at all related to public opinion? And as Giacomo said, actually, this is one of the best areas that have been studied by multi-level and multivariate analyses using MIPEX. And here we actually see a lot of very positive results. So actually, I would say that integration policies are much more in harmony with public opinion than they are in conflict. And that's illustrated by this correlation graph showing the MIPEX overall score across the world with Gallup's Migrant Acceptance Index. And you see a very striking, strong relationship that has then proven out in many multivariate analyses, whether you're looking at public political attitudes, are they pro or anti-immigrant? What are the levels of xenophobia in a country, levels of Islamophobia, the extent of public social trust, or even one study looking at the level of social interaction between immigrants and the public, all find that there is a kind of virtuous or vicious cycle between integration policies and public opinion, that they evolve together. Some argue that policies have a real driving focus on and effect on public opinion unless you have a real politicization through the far right of integration policy. But at least in this case, we can say there doesn't actually seem to be as much of a discursive gap as we would have expected. Instead, there's much more of a strong linkage between policy and public opinion. Both of them are very slow to change over time. Integration policies are very rarely reformed, and when they are, we talk about a small path dependency set of changes rather than a huge overhaul of the system. And same with public opinion, which tends to move very slowly over time. Both policies and public opinion seem to be very strongly influenced by the political culture and political trust. This doesn't mean to say that there are no gaps. Perhaps because there's increasing polarization in our politics, there are gaps between the government in power and policies, because even if a government might be very far left or far right, they're actually not necessarily able to make huge structural changes to integration policies if public opinion is not with them. And we might also see a greater polarization within the public, where even if on average the public still is supportive of inclusive integration policies, we could have greater divergence between the far left and the far right. But still, there's not as much of a gap here as we might think. So then the question I would say, which is a major focus in the field, is efficacy gaps. So the effects of integration policies. So are there major efficacy gaps in this field? From looking at the literature, as Giacomo said, it depends on the policy area and for whom. But I would say I don't think that the efficacy gaps are as big as we would expect. It really depends on your benchmark for success, because many of these studies do find that inclusive policies are one major factor. And in some cases, they are the major factor, influencing the attitudes and participation of immigrants and the public. I highlight here a great overall example, again, between MIPEX and the World Happiness Report, which we all know, looking at not just whether a specific country is a happy place to be for everyone, but particularly for the foreign-born. And here you also see a strong relationship between inclusive integration policies and immigrants' overall levels of happiness. That is also confirmed by other studies that look at immigrants' self-reported well-being, sense of belonging, pride, other elements of attitudes. And so we'll get into this in the remaining part of the webinar, but you see specific links between integration policies and immigrants' future in the country. So inclusive integration policies help to secure that through naturalization and settlement. Inclusive policies seem to catalyze changes in attitudes as a two-way process. So more inclusive policies can close some of those gaps in self-reported life satisfaction, belonging. They also can help to open up opportunity structures and close some of the gaps in opportunities, for example, in the health system or in the political system. And interestingly, these studies help us to find which type of outcomes policies might be influencing and which they might not. So for example, most studies do not find a relationship between integration policies and things like employment rates, unemployment rates, education rates. Those are more determined by individual level factors, immigration policies, the labor market at the time. But actually, these policies can help the process of socioeconomic integration because they will help to improve the speed of that process. So having progress over time, having greater skill investment among immigrants, greater language acquisition, greater educational resilience. So there are some efficacy, let's say, links that we do find. But if looking at the next slide, I mean, these studies do also help us have more realistic expectations for our policies. Are policies on their own significant? And again, we will discuss this later on in the webinar, but here I just take, building on Konrad Ziller's work, the findings from the last EU MIDAS study from the FRA, which looked at whether immigrants who said that they were victims of discrimination, whether they said that they knew the laws on discrimination, and whether they were reporting those discrimination cases. And Konrad Ziller will go more into his research, which does find these types of links that emerge between policy and discrimination awareness and reporting and trust, which evolve over time. So we can see in these simple correlation graphs that if you compare the situation, say, in Estonia and Sweden, the well-developed comprehensive policies in Sweden do seem to be having certain effects. 90% of discriminated immigrants in Sweden say they know the law, and about 30% report cases, which is much more than in Estonia. But you can also ask, is this sufficient? In Sweden, only 1/3 of immigrants who say they've been victims of discrimination actually are reporting that case. So what does this tell us? Is this the best that we can do? If all of our countries became Sweden, is the most reasonable that we could expect a reporting rate of 1/3? Does this mean that we have to have radically different policies with more radical imagination? Or perhaps there's something else missing. And that's the last point, which is on implementation gaps. And that is really understudied and often unknown. in our field. I just took some of my own work from my PhD that looked at impacts of naturalization procedures, not just the laws, but actually the bureaucracy, the documentation, and this found that procedural elements mattered as much as laws, particularly for influencing immigrants' interest in naturalization. So I would really encourage those of you who are researchers to create more indicators of policy implementation, looking at elements of procedures, at resources, at the professionalization and diversity of the sector, at the involvement of volunteers and communities, because perhaps the problems of implementation explain why some of our policies are not fully effective.
Thank you very much, Thomas. So thank you very much, and we will move now to the second part of the webinar, in which we display cases and examples of this analysis linking MIPEX to integration and migrant integration outcomes. We will start with Professor Juarez, so the floor is yours. Thank you. You're muted.
I'm sorry. Can you see my screen, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me to participate at this very interesting webinar. My name is Sol Juarez. I work at the Department of Public Health Sciences at Stockholm University, where I do research on migration and health. So in this short presentation, I will basically talk about the MIPEX index in the context of my field and in the context of my own research. And then I will conclude my presentation with some reflections about the potential of MIPEX for future health research. So let me begin by saying that in the field of migration and health, there are at least two well-established observations. One is the evidence that migrants usually have good health. Actually, they tend to show better health outcomes than the native populations in the receiving context. This is usually referred to as the healthy migrant paradox. And as you might know, this is paradoxical because most migrants come from poorer socioeconomic context and they experience social disadvantages themselves in the receiving country. The other observation is that most migrants, or we see that migrants' health tend to deteriorate with their increasing duration of residence in the host country. So if we put this together, that means that overall migrants arrive with good health, but over time they tend to deteriorate, their health tend to deteriorate, tend to converge to the levels of the native population. So to me, this is a clear evidence that the social conditions in the host country matters, or in other words, that this is an indication of the role of migrant integration efforts. But even though in the area of migration and health and in public health in general, there is a growing recognition of the importance of policies, to be honest, in practice, most studies tend to look exclusively to health-related policies. And here you have some examples of systematic reviews that they are looking at basically use and access to healthcare. So I think that the lack of attention to these other types of policies are quite important because, as you might have noticed, different orientations support different types of policies. So, for example, migration and social policies are generally framed within this sovereign state with, by the way, increasing hostile views about migrants, while on the contrary, health policies are generally placed within this international human rights framework, meaning that all individuals should have rights to health. So what I'm trying to say is that it seems that we are precisely overlooking policies that could have a major impact on migrant health. And of course, there are studies that look at the health effect of these other type of policies, but so far there has been a lack of systematic evidence on that. And this is why a couple of years ago, we decided to conduct an international systematic review looking at precisely the health effect of non-health targeted policies. So in this study, we try to collect basically evidence from policies operating throughout the migration process, that is from the entry, resettlement, and what we call it, the integration phase. You're more than welcome to read the entire paper, but what I would like to mention and highlight here is that even though we meta-analyzed studies considered of high quality evidence, that is using quasi-experimental analysis, for instance, the most relevant findings, and when I say relevant findings, are those that were included in policy briefs, in press release, and also those that were easy to communicate to the society in general, including policy makers. Those came from few cross-sectional studies that actually used the MIPEX index. So here is just an example of these results that you can find in our publication. This is about the association between integration policies and self-rated health. And as you can see in this picture, it says that basically, relative to more inclusive context, overall assimilationist, exclusionist, and other type of restrictive contexts are in general associated with poor self-rated health. So I think that this finding were particularly interesting in the context of our study, because this shows that despite specific policies, the overall climate could have a major impact on the health of migrants. So just to conclude my presentation, I would like to talk a little bit about the potential that I see MIPEX has in future migration and health research. As I mentioned before, studies looking at the health effect of integration policies are very limited. And I think that this is in part because we have this tendency or this idea that we can only evaluate policies for the purpose that they were designed, which means that by definition, we are overlooking the unintended health consequences of these policies. So in this context, I think that the MIPEX index offers a unique opportunity for people like me who are interested in systematizing evidence on a particular health outcome for migrants, incorporating this policy integration approach. So in the context of a systematic review, the MIPEX index can be really helpful to organize the evidence in a way that we can, for example, compare the results between countries with different levels of integration. And actually, if we are able to use the subdomains of the MIPEX index, maybe we are at a better place to answer this question about what policy matters and for whom. So thank you very much. I hope it's still within my time.
Yeah, thank you very much. It was just on time, perfect. Okay, so that now we move to Martin Vink. So the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Giacomo, and hello everyone. Greetings from. Sorry, let me start at the beginning. Greetings from Florence. So I'm happy to talk about citizenship, and so that means that I'm most interested in the MIPEX domain access to nationality, which I think is a very well. Developed domain that has been well studied. There's a lot of expertise on the conditions under which migrants and also their children can acquire citizenship. And I wanted to talk about three things in the couple of minutes that I have here, just to give you a taste of what is out there. And I think it's important to distinguish here between direct effects, which will be the first one that is listed here, and indirect effects of policies. And the direct effects, I think, are the most straightforward and are, I think, fairly well established and also intuitive. And this also makes sense. So if you make citizenship, the general lesson there is, if you make citizenship more difficult to acquire, then fewer migrants will naturalize. So in general, of course, we as social scientists, we all struggle with making the link between policies and effects. And so we have to deal with many challenges here. But I think if I look at the MIPEX domains, I would say that maybe the link between citizenship policies and citizenship acquisition rates is is perhaps one of the most direct links. Right? So you can think about countries where you can become a citizen after 5 years. This is the most frequent number of required years of residence, and countries where you have to wait for 10 years, right? So if you have to wait for 10 years until you become a citizen, then simply you cannot become a citizen after 5 years. And so the link with the outcome is straightforward. But I think it's, and I will show you a couple of examples of that, but I think it's also important to keep in mind that acquiring citizenship also is related to outcomes in other related domains of immigrant integration, and these are what we might call indirect effects. And there's quite a well-developed literature now on the so-called citizenship premium, right? So acquiring citizenship is also related to outcomes most studied in labor market domains. But there are also a couple of studies. I did one on health outcomes, for example. And thirdly, another indirect effect that's I think important is also the conditions under which citizenship might matter. And this is where policies also have an effect, because as I already said, sometimes if policies are more restrictive, it means that migrants will take longer to naturalize. Okay, now let me just give you a snapshot of a couple of things that are out there with some references that can be made available also later. Right? So in a previous study that I did in 2013, we used cross-sectional data from the European Social Survey of immigrants residing in Europe, and we matched that with the conditions under which citizenship could be acquired as measured by the MIPEX access to nationality. And within the data set that we used, that ranged between 29 and 79. And so there's quite a large variation, and what we found is that there is indeed a positive relation between access to nationality and the propensity of acquiring citizenship. But the first thing that's important is the heterogeneous effect. So actually this we found only for migrants from low and medium developed countries, but for migrants from higher developed countries, we did not find that relation. So the lines would be more or less flat there. And the logic behind that is that, of course, policies matter most for those people who are most interested in this, right? So migrants from higher developed countries have a lower propensity to naturalize in the first place. And this positive relation between policies and outcomes actually holds for different residence groups. So the bottom line is for migrants who have lived between 6 and 10 years, and also holds for migrants who will live for longer in the country. And this was also validated in the work by Thomas Handelston that he just mentioned, and a couple of papers are out there where you can see that this also holds for law and procedures. Okay, so here we used the previous study, we used cross-sectional data, but I'm also interested in seeing a bit at a more fine-grained level what's going on. So in the current project that I'm doing, the ERC-funded My Life Status project, we use administrative data from the Netherlands, Denmark, and Sweden, which are 3 countries with really very extreme variation in the conditions under which citizenship can be acquired. 5 years in the Netherlands and Sweden, and 9 in Denmark. But in Sweden, there are very few conditions, but in the Netherlands, since 2003, you need to do an integration exam, and that you also need to do in Denmark, and you need to speak Danish at B1, B2 level, depending on the period. Now, what we see is that this translates quite directly, not only in overall differences in naturalization rates, but also quite strikingly in the speed of naturalization. And from a democratic perspective, I think this is quite remarkable. After 20 years, if you look at the variation, 80% of migrants in Sweden will have become a Swedish citizen, whereas this is only 1/3 of migrants in Denmark. And so this I think really is a striking link between policies and outcomes. Okay, well, indirect effects, what we know about that. So there's quite a lot of literature on citizenship and labor market outcomes. So in this study from 2020, we see that we looked at employment, and we found that indeed there is this, when we do an individual fixed effects regression, so we look at naturalization before, and we look at labor market outcomes before and after naturalization within individuals who we track over time. We see that indeed there is such a boost also in employment and in earnings. But this is particularly for migrants from less developed countries. So again, also the citizenship premium is stronger for those marginalized groups. And that's something that we also find in Switzerland. For example, our colleagues Heinmuller et al., who have used quasi-experimental methods, found in principle similar findings. So there is a earnings premium, and this matters especially for more marginalized migrants. Okay, going to wrap up. Last indirect effect is that we also see that the speed of naturalization matters. And this is important because policies translate very directly in the speed of naturalization. And what we found in the Netherlands is that indeed the payoff of acquiring citizenship for migrants is stronger if they naturalize more quickly, so within 5 years, and then it starts to decrease. That also makes sense because, you know, if you're going to naturalize after 10 or 20 years, how can this still affect life outcomes among migrants? And again, similar findings we find in Switzerland for a larger social integration scale. There is such a bonus for citizens, but this is especially for marginalized groups. And again, it is especially the case when naturalization occurs earlier rather than later. Okay, so I could say much more, and maybe there are things that we can talk about in the Q&A. Yeah, I'm really interested to see MIPEX develop further, and certainly I fully encourage the global expansion. Of course, there are important things that we should discuss there in terms of matching this with the outcome variables, right? So if we talk about naturalization rates, in Europe, we have some data that we can match the policies with. At the global level, this becomes more challenging, right? So there are all kinds of challenges that we will bump into, but yeah, I don't think they should stop us from doing this, but there are, of course, important things to be discussed. So thanks a lot. I'll leave it here.
Thank you very much, Martin. So before moving to the last speaker, Conrad, I would like just to remind the participant that they can start writing down their questions in the chat, so that then we can start the Q&A question. So now, Conrad, the floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. Yeah, so now in my presentation, I focus on the effects of anti-discrimination policies. And first of all, the question is, what are the mechanisms for how policies matter for denizens' attitudes and behaviors? And the policy feedback framework provides some mechanisms that are relevant also in this domain. And one is resource effects. So for example, individuals that are prone to experience discrimination, they will have a higher chance to find an adequate job if discrimination is prohibited and effectively sanctioned in a country. And then we have interpretive effects. They refer to informational and normative content these policies convey. And for example, if you have in a country an agency that assists victims of discrimination to navigate the legal process, this will likely influence also the self-efficacy and the well-being of these victims and possibly minority members more generally. In my research, I looked at the relationship between anti-discrimination policies, citizens' knowledge about their rights, and discrimination. And for citizens' knowledge about their rights, I refer to the proportion of people in a country that say that if they become a victim of discrimination, they know the law, they know the rights they have. And this is some sort of, at the aggregate level, some sort of literacy in a country. So it's the amount of people who know when something like this happens, how to proceed. I used several waves of comparative survey data. And as a dependent variable in this study from 2014, I used several measures of discrimination. So experienced discrimination, witnessed discrimination in one's immediate social circle. Sociotropic discrimination refers to the prevalence or the perceived prevalence of discrimination in a country, and self-identification with a discriminated group. And anti-discrimination policy scores from the MIPEX, and they are measured like also in sub-indicators. So which types of discrimination are covered? This is one sub-indicator. Then what are the fields these anti-discrimination policies apply to? So labor market or private sector, public sector and so on. How strong are the enforcement mechanisms, and also how comprehensive is the implementation of these measures. So these are the sub-indicators of the MIPEX anti-discrimination scores. And what I find is that anti-discrimination policies tend to increase knowledge of rights. So in countries where we have strong anti-discrimination policies, people tend to know more about their rights to equal treatment on average. And this is like compared across countries, but you can also look at this knowledge of rights in an aggregated way. So this literacy rate, if you will, how this evolves over time. And I find from longitudinal multi-level models that an increase in knowledge of rights over time leads to higher levels of witness discrimination in one's immediate surrounding. It leads to lower levels of sociotropic perceptions of discrimination and lower levels of self-identification with a discriminated group. And this this leads me with the conclusion that knowledge of rights and indirectly these anti-discrimination policies that foster them in the first place increase people's awareness about discrimination and strengthen their self-efficacy towards discrimination. In a second study, together with Mark Helbling, we looked at to what extent anti-discrimination laws foster political support in Europe, both among target groups, for instance, immigrants, as well as the general population. Again, we use several data sets of survey data and also the MIPEX scores. And what we do here is also we look at egalitarian values and experience discrimination as moderators. So what do we find here? We find that an expansion of anti-discrimination measures over time relates to higher levels of political support, but only for immigrants or people who experienced discrimination in the past. So for the general public, these laws as such do not so much matter, but what matters for the general public is that we find also that an increase in knowledge of rights, again, at the aggregate level, leads to greater political support also among the general public, and particularly strong for people who hold egalitarian values, so those who advocate equal treatment. And in a third study, I looked at how do institutional fairness and anti-discrimination policies influence immigrants' social trust. So we have lots of literature about the institutional roots of social trust. So in contexts where institutions are perceived as strong and reliable and have a high quality, this also reassures people in dealing with each other. So this improves social trust in general. So this literature exists, and I looked specifically at immigrants' trust here. Again, comparative survey data merged with measures on institutional fairness and also on anti-discrimination policies. So what I found here is that anti-discrimination policies tend to decrease the gap in inter-ethnic social trust, so that immigrants overproportionally profit from the implementation of anti-discrimination policies, also in terms of social trust. But what I also find is that the colorblind institutional fairness, so that the principle of equal treatment exists in a country, and if this becomes stronger over time, this increases the gap in inter-ethnic social trust. And the question is, of course, why? And due to several supplementary analyses, I found that in these contexts, so where we have high institutional fairness, immigrants particularly advocate equal treatment and have a high standard of being treated equally. But the thing is, or the explanation here is that they have this expectation of equal treatment, but due to remaining discrimination and unequal treatment, this expectation is not met, and this leaves immigrants with comparatively lower trust levels compared to natives. So the trust gaps become higher here, and this refers to the so-called integration paradox, so which is mainly an unintended consequence in the integration process. Immigrants that are better integrated objectively, let's say, they still feel less integrated and perceive more discrimination compared to those who are less well integrated in objective terms. So what are critical lessons from my research here? I find that anti-discrimination policies have salutary effects for immigrants, as well as people prone to experience discrimination more generally. it impacts different domains, so knowledge of rights, social trust, also political engagement. Not all equal treatment regulations promote immigrant integration. This is what I found in the last study. So there are unintended consequences, and this makes it even more important to do research on sub-indicators, so related to the purpose of anti-discrimination or equal treatment, the implementation side, and what about positive action. These are all sub-fields of anti-discrimination policies or equal treatment regulations that are worthwhile to look in greater detail at. And MIPEX data allows for longitudinal studies, and the question is, how can we implement survey experiments also in an ethical way to use this as an extension of what we already know. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Conrad. So now is the time to ask the question if you have any remarks or doubts. So far we received 2 questions, and then I have a question myself. So we'll start with the question from the audience, and then I will move to mine if there are no other questions. These 2 questions are addressed to Thomas, but I mean the other speakers can also answer if they want to say something on that. So the first question is about the choice of indicators of outcomes. So far we have used mostly, not only, but also mostly hard indicators like unemployment rate or something like that. And so the question is that Thomas suggests to move away, let's say, or partially move away from these indicators and to focus mainly on more soft indicators, like, for example, emotional stability or satisfaction. And if Thomas, you have also other example of these indicators. The second one is if during our meta-analysis we found evidence for differences in based on time-lagged effects. So Thomas, if you want to answer.
Sure, I'll take the second question first, and on the first question, I'll be interested if the other panelists want to add in their domains. Did we see effects of policy change? No, because part of it is an empirical problem that policies are very slow to change over time. And when they do, it's usually in different countries in different ways, right? So you wouldn't really expect to see changes across the board, at least in the integration field. I know in those studying asylum policies have found certain dynamics between countries where countries change all their policies at similar times, and you can measure that. It's hard because of the nature of policy, but it's also hard because of the nature of the data sets that most researchers are using, which are the few available transnational data sets that often require you to pool data across several years in order to have a sufficiently large sample to look at say 15 to 20 countries, and that makes it hard to look at policy effects. In terms of what we should be looking at with outcomes, I really do here have a challenge for researchers, because what I notice is that in the past we had a very kind of kitchen sink approach to our multivariate analyses, being let's throw in a lot of outcome variables and see what sticks. There's also been a tendency to engage with policy at a very superficial level. So policies aim for integration, they aim for employment, they aim to stop racism. So let's see if these policies do that for all groups and all times. I think that when you're going to be researching a particular domain, it's very important for you to understand what that policy actually does, because that gives you an idea of the specificity of that intervention. And so then you could know what that intervention itself can have as an outcome, and particularly for which type of target group. And so I'll just give you some examples. In the area of labor market mobility, Wouter Zwijsen has a great working paper where, again, he looks not into whether integration policies lead to employment, but whether they lead to language acquisition, language courses, further in domestic training for immigrants, broken down by their different reason for migration and also looking differently for EU citizens and non-EU citizens. And this really does correspond to what labor market integration policies do. I mean, governments don't give immigrants jobs. Governments, part of their work is making certain areas open to them based on their legal status, but a lot of it is actually helping them invest in their skills. So our studies there should be looking more at skill acquisition rather than at outcomes. And two of the studies that I found have been really useful for opening our minds are actually here. I think that Solwares's collective work in the Lancet helped us to realize that when we think about integration policies' impacts on health, it's not just in particular quote unquote objective measures of health. It's actually in a comprehensive understanding of health. Because most of these policy interventions are trying to limit the obstacles that immigrants might face to accessing different types of services, gathering information, resourcing those services to be able to better serve immigrants, and that would be better captured then by more comprehensive measures of health, and often very subjective measures of health. And same with the work of Konrad Ziller here. I've heard very often that our anti-discrimination policies have failed across Europe because racism still exists. And while anti-discrimination policies at the superficial level are trying to fight racism, we know that they don't stop racism. Just like, you know, criminal justice does not stop crime from happening. Rather, I think Konrad Ziller's work has showed us that these policies are actually about access to justice. So justice is a process that requires trust in the system, and justice is not just what happens through our legal institutions, but also through our political institutions. And so again, by having a more reflective approach to what these policies really are intended and able to address, I think we can better find the outcome indicators that would make sense for this type of analysis.
Thank you, Thomas. In the meantime, we received two additional questions. The first one is particularly for Martin and Sol, but also for the other speaker, of course. So the audience asks you to elaborate a little bit more on the effect across different subgroups. And then the second one is for Konrad. It's very long, so I will try to read it. They ask you to elaborate on the unintended consequences of anti-discrimination policies in terms of the integration paradox. Do you think that anti-discrimination policies could increase sensitivity to discrimination, perhaps increasing perceived discrimination for someone? So I don't know who wants to start. I don't know, Martin, for example.
Sure, Giacomo. So thanks, Liv, for the question on the heterogeneity of the effects. Well, there's a lot to say about this. And it differs a bit between the direct effect on citizenship acquisition rates and the effects of citizenship on labor market outcomes. So citizenship policies, I think, yeah, the effect is strongest in general on those who are most interested to naturalize. So if you are not at all interested to acquire the citizenship of the destination country, whether citizenship is difficult or easier to get, doesn't really matter for you. So that, I think, is a clear logic, and that's why that's also what we see in various analysis, both on the basis of cross-national, cross-sectional data, but also longitudinal data within national context. The main exception here that I would highlight is a dual citizenship, where we see that actually this matters especially for migrants from higher developed countries and in Europe from EU countries. So migrants who are typically not so inclined to naturalize would only naturalize if they can hold on to their valuable origin country citizenship. So dual citizenship affects actually, whereas from less developed countries, migrants are willing to make that trade-off, let's say, to trade in their, would say, quote unquote, less valuable citizenship for the highly valuable destination country citizenship. On the indirect effect of policies through citizenship on labor market outcomes, we see that this matters mostly for more marginalized groups who, at least in the labor market, tend to suffer more strongly from statistical discrimination. Right? So employers have to make shortcuts in making hiring decisions, and yeah, part of those shortcuts may be background and origin, and yeah, it's often hypothesized, although I think the evidence for this is still more indirect than direct. that citizenship helps migrants to overcome some of that statistical discrimination. And that would also, again, be the case, especially for those who are more prone to suffer from that kind of statistical discrimination in the labor market. But we find similar patterns also for in the rental market and home ownership, for example. I think I will stop here, Giacomo, for sake of the time.
Yeah, thank you. Sol?
Yes, my answer would be very short, because in our case, it was, I mean, we were restricted by the data that we collected. So we identified 6 studies using the MIPEX index in relation to health outcomes. And we were a bit restricted by the analysis that the studies offered to us. So in our case, we couldn't, for example, see variation, but depending on, for example, whether they were refugee migrants versus labor migrants or this type of things. But of course, what I tried to say during my presentation is that this can be expanded. I mean, we can look at, for example, specifically self-reported health for migrants in general, and then use the MIPEX index to reorganize this information. And there we will be able to perhaps do this kind of analysis.
Okay, thank you. Conrad, do you have an answer to the other question?
Regarding your first question about the subgroups, I think that people prone to be discriminated against, that this is a very particular group, and this is like a subgroup we can look at, and then we can also look at whether, different kinds of discrimination, so perceived discrimination, experienced discrimination, and all of them have or might have potentially have different effects. This is important. And the other thing is, if we look at the general public, I think it's really important to distinguish people who have similar, or who advocate these policies, who have similar mindsets and similar attitudes, and they respond differently to those who basically just don't care and maybe are just not exposed to these regulations, and that they're not like, if they're not interested, they will not be reached by these policies. So because they are not having similar values, and they are not like themselves victims to discrimination. So this also raises the question of how the policy content is like distributed among the public, and also refers to like possible solutions like information campaigns and agencies that promote these principles. But still, I think there's much more research needed in order to look at subgroups and involvement over time of these policies. And regarding the other question about the unintended consequences, it's basically what's in the question. That's basically the outcome of the study, that not in context where we have specific policies aiming at anti-discrimination, so more like the positive action side of the process, so more the institutional quality, colorblind, equal treatment regulation. And in this case, you have higher social norms, so to say, about equal treatment, and they leave immigrants and minorities more and with a higher expectation, and therefore more sensitive to experience discrimination, and then more negative outcomes. So I think it's important to take these unintended consequences into account, because they exist. But also the question is, how do they evolve over time? So during individual integration processes, of course, but also during the different phases of immigration. So, and we would like to study, or one example would be to look at now refugees from Syria. And if you look at them, you could like really study and look at whether these different phases also apply to them, also in dependence on policy. But this is also something which needs to be done and which has not been done yet.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. So I see that we are already late. So if there are no additional questions, I'm going to conclude. I just want to thank you, all the speakers and the participants. I hope that you have enjoyed the webinar. I invite you to look at mipex.eu website for additional information on MIPEX, but also on the research that we presented. And I wish you just a great afternoon and weekend. Bye-bye.